Good morning, everyone. I call this meeting to order. We'll begin with introductions, starting with Mr. McGuire.
Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Oh, Suzanne Lonis-Croft, MLA, Lunenburg.
Good morning, Margaret Miller, MLA for Hants East.
Joachim Stroink, Halifax, Shabakdo.
Ian Rankin, Timberley Prospect.
Chris Tonchermont, Argyle, Barrington.
Maureen McDonald, Halifax, Needham.
Morning, Dave Wilson, Sackville, Cobequid.
I'm Alan McMaster, your chair, MLA for Inverness. Mr. Conrad, please begin with by introducing yourself and your colleagues, and perhaps go into your opening comments as well.
Good morning. So thank you very much for having us. So I'm Jeff Conrad. I'm the Deputy Minister of Internal Services, and I'm very pleased to have with me today our Chief Procurement Officer, Chris Mitchell, Chris is relatively new to the department, having spent many years with the Department of National Defence in a procurement career, and then a couple of years with the Halifax Regional Municipality before coming over to join us a few months ago. So I'm very excited to have Chris with me. I'm also thrilled to have Natalie McLean with me today. Natalie's the department's Director of Procurement Enablement and has significant experience in procurement work with the province, and she's one of the people that have been really instrumental in developing a lot of the solutions that you're going to hear about this morning as we talk about the findings of the Auditor General. So it's nice to have Natalie with us. So I'd like to thank the committee for inviting the Department of Internal Services to appear today on the procurement issues, specifically on the Auditor General's review of the professional services contracts, which was released last spring. I believe that audits are undertaken with the intent to identify opportunities for improvement in our departments. Every audit is designed to identify places where improvement is needed or possible, and this audit did that for us, citing 9 specific recommendations that we need to follow. I was also pleased that the audit highlighted a number of positive findings and supported the work that we are doing. For example, the audit highlights that the use of external professional services was adequately supported for all 31 of the files they reviewed, and there were technical or project-related reasons for using professional services contracts. The audit also noted that while there are areas to be improved, contracts protect the public interest through defined responsibilities, clear payment terms, required completion dates, and other criteria. There are many other examples in the audit where it notes ways in which the 6 departments which were under review comply with the province's procurement legislation and policies in areas like evaluation criteria, alternative procurement, standing offer processes, and the monitoring of professional services contracts. I'd like to thank the Auditor General and his team for making the effort to include those comments, because it helps assure us that we have a great base upon which to build in responding to the recommendations. The report did include 9 recommendations, all of which have been accepted by our department. Implementing these recommendations will help us better evaluate vendors' performance and compliance, resolve performance disputes between vendors and the province, ensure that we have adequate approvals where that has not happened in the past. As we noted at the time of the report, some process improvements were already in development. Some have since been implemented, and work continues on the remaining ones. Since coming to this role at Internal Services, I would say certainly one of my personal learnings would be around the complexity of the procurement process. What seems to be a simple purchasing decision is often a very complex issue, interwoven with trade agreements, procurement law, the need to balance transparency and protect business-sensitive information, and a range of other factors. The improvements we will make as a result of the audit are critical because of the nature of this government procurement activity. Every year, government departments purchase more than $800 million worth of goods and services, with a similar level of activity in the health sector. Almost every day, a dozen or more tenders, requests for proposals, and requests for information are posted on our procurement website. That website contains tenders from the provincial government and its agencies, boards and commissions, as well as broader public service entities such as the community college, universities, Nova Scotia municipalities, school boards, and the healthcare sector. As recognized by the audit, responses are evaluated to provide Nova Scotians with the best possible value for each dollar spent. Potential vendors know by which criteria their bids will be assessed, which helps create a level playing field for everyone. These criteria, of course, vary with the complexity of the good or service being sought. And while some may believe that the lowest price is always the key decision point, there is much more to determining best value for government. Vendors must have the experience, the knowledge, and the ability to deliver the right products and services at the right place, the right time, and at the right price. In closing, I would just like to acknowledge and thank the team at Procurement Services. They come to work every day with an eye towards ensuring that the departments that we work with and entities that we work with are well served and can in turn provide excellent service to the Nova Scotians who depend on them. This fact has been recognized in each of the past 2 years by the National Procurement Institute, who has awarded our Procurement Services team with the Achievement of Excellence in Procurement Award. So it's very exciting for us to be recognized outside of the department. On that note, I look forward to questions from the members.
Thank you, Mr. Conrad. We'll begin with Mr. D'Entremont of the PC Caucus for 20 minutes.
Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and of course to the staff. Jeff, Chris, Natalie, thank you for being here today and answering some of our questions when it comes to procurement. Procurement, of course, a very important part of the way government does its business, as we need our services and products every day to continue. Procurement has been in a whole bunch of places over the last 10 years. And I'm just wondering, maybe as a top-line question, just is Internal Services the place for it? How's it going in that department? Because, I mean, even in my time of hanging around Halifax, it's been a part of finance, it's been a part of transportation infrastructure renewal, it's been a part of economic development, you know, and I think it was back somewhere else and then back to transportation infrastructure renewal. So I'm just saying, you know, can we hope that it's going to stay in internal services, and, you know, how's that marriage going at this point?
Mr. Conrad.
Thank you. I would say yes, it is in the right place. So when I think back to the creation of internal services and some of the rationale that was put in place around why they created the department, one of the reasons for putting this department together was to get folks together that were like-minded and had a focus on some of the internal services or corporate type services of government. So, you know, procurement in terms of being in our department really, I think, allowed two things. So one, previously in economic development or some of the other departments you've talked about, freed those departments up to really focus their time on some of their core issues, and place procurement in a department where there's a concerted effort and a group of executives that are thinking along many similar lines in terms of how do we manage services, how do we best support, what does client service look like in an organization which is providing internal services, how do we ensure we're providing quality, how do we work differently with partners. So I think it's in the right place. You know, I think it's really an opportunity for us to advance a lot of the issues, and as a result of some of the work we're doing with other entities, we've really moved both on the delivery side and on the structure side fairly significant in the last year since it's come to the department.
From a central agency now, and I remember, you know, a number of years ago, procurement was, you know, in some cases done by each individual department, and maybe procurement service would provide a little bit of expertise to help those departments procure items, whether it was a snow plow or whether it was, you know, a medical device. Like the range was pretty vast. The centralization of procurement, I think, has been a tremendous undertaking. So I'm just wondering, how are you working with the partners? How have the partners accepted the centralized view of things? Because you know, I'll talk later on about Tri-County School Board a little upset about not being able to procure certain things in their local area that they need to go through the standing list. So I'm just wondering how those partners across the province are dealing with that central procurement policy.
Sure. So maybe I'll turn the majority of the response over to Chris, to Mr. Mitchell. But I guess I would say at the highest level, you know, it's one of those things I think that we've gotten great support, we've gotten great response from the partner entities and agencies that we work with. I think at the you know, the philosophical level, there's great support to the work that we're doing. People are very committed to doing the work well together. We're working our way through a number of structural issues around things like providing assurances and standards and service level agreements, and how do we put together some of the structure that would go in place around these things. Individual agreements, there's always a challenge, or often a challenge around how do we make sure that we're respecting the need to support local business as well as respecting things like trade agreements and some of that kind of stuff. So maybe I'll stop there and let Mr. Mitchell say a few words.
Mr. Mitchell?
Thank you very much. Further to Jeff's point, I think things are actually going well. I think most of the feedback we've had from the service or the client departments that we're looking after, whether it's from a provision of advice or an advisory role, or whether it's actually completing the procurements for them, it's new. It's certainly going through some pains to try and figure out both sides of the fence, what they're expecting of us and what we're expected to deliver. But I think the experience has been extremely positive. Certainly the Nova Scotia Health Authorities and the Department of Health piece with the work that we've been doing with them, with you know, with the municipalities, et cetera, who come for advisory responsibility. It has been working well, and I think it's new. It's going to continue to grow over the coming months and years to be a more successful piece, but I think it's actually got some good foundation. It'll start well.
A lot of the creation of internal services, and of course moving the procurement piece there, was to provide consistency across the departments and some cost savings. I think we talked about, when government had released it, they talked about maybe a $60 million savings to go across government. So how are we doing on that one? Are we starting to get good contracts, good deals on items as we amalgamate, you know, 10 different procurement requests for the same item?
Mr. Mitchell?
Thank you very much. Actually, we are. We're in the beginning stage, as I mentioned, but with some of the enablement tools which we've brought on now, so we have, specific to health, we've brought over about 20-odd full-time equivalent people, so my staff has grown by that expertise of the people who understand the health services world. We've built some good fundamental ability to engage with their leadership to determine what the requirements are that they're looking for. We stitch that alongside some strategic sourcing expertise, which is on my staff, to determine, as you're mentioning, some of the things which probably will lead to some of the bigger savings for government. With the Ariba tool that Jeff spoke to earlier, it's only brand new. It stood up last week, but it will begin to give us some spend visibility of the areas which are the most likely to provide those kind of savings that the government is looking for. And so as we get those, as we get the people on the ground, get them skilled up, as we get the enablement tools from an SAP or from a policy perspective put in place, we are already starting to see those benefits, and we will continue to build on some of those successes over the coming 12 to 18 to 24 months.
In the report, it talks a lot about standing lists and getting people on standing lists and service contracts and those kinds of things. I just want to talk about the process there for a minute. I have a constituent. She provides training, and so she wanted to figure out how to get on the standing list. And of course, we went online and we did our work there to get the documentation that would be required for her to provide that kind of training, and then start filling it out. And then we hit the wall because there's a lot of information that's required by the department. And then we called the 1-800 number. I think it was 1-800 number. It was a 424 number. Regardless, she did get the information she needed. She did successfully fill out that document. She's now on the standing list. So I'm just wondering, what's the experience right now of those who are getting themselves on standing lists, and is it working okay? Or because I did find it pretty onerous for an individual that's providing one particular little service, and they're sort of a mom-pop kind of organization trying to be on those lists. So just a general question there.
Mr. Conrad?
Maybe again, I'll just make a few opening comments, and then Chris can speak a little more detail. Yeah. But one of the things we've recognized is that there is a need for us to find ways to make it simpler and better for Nova Scotian companies to get on standing offer lists and other opportunities like that. So there was a time in which we only opened those standing offers every 2 years to people to be on the list. So in addition to the need to document and provide the kinds of things you're talking about, there were also a number of restraints in terms of when you could get on and how long the window was open and those things. So we've moved over the last 2 years to move to a new system which has allowed us to allow people to come into the list when they're ready rather than when we're ready. So one of the things I think in terms of when you talk about what are the opportunities for improvement, what are the customer service focuses that we have, I think there are opportunities for us to continue to improve exactly that kind of example where we can move to making it more responsive to the interests that we hear from both the buyers and the vendors. So that's one of the things we've done. Chris may be able to speak a little more about the process for getting on and some of that kind of level.
Mr. Mitchell?
Thank you. The process that Jeff's speaking to is an interesting balanced process. So part of it, I'm delighted to hear that the individual was eventually able to get on, because that's in fact what we're looking for. The ability for vendors out there to join at any part during the year instead of the once every 2 year onto a standing offer was driven by the vendor community saying, you need to become more flexible. The part which the government gains from this thing is now, as a third party is organizing the bid qualifications for folks who come in, there's a pre-qual to get them into a FlexTrack kind of database. We are experiencing, from government's perspective, of much better, much tighter control over much of the topic which the Auditor General report was all about, which is control over that professional service, control over that outsourcing of, control over the re-upping of the same person all the time. So in this case, we run them through a third-party vendor. FlexTrack is the actual program, and the experience has been excellent to date. I think it gets better as people begin to understand how to get into the program and understand that they have an opportunity to be asked for or bid on a number of different projects, where in the past they may not have, because certain departments may have been more comfortable with a particular company or a particular vendor. So it's actually, the experience has been excellent. We're about to add a third component into that one relatively shortly.
Okay. In the AG report, it said that government needs to assess, and this is going to personal contracts for the most part, to assess the risk of possible employee-employer relationships with contractors. And I think more specifically, they've asked the CRA for, I would say, rulings on individuals who have been hired as private contractors. So sort of trying to find that line between actual employees of government versus contractors. So I'm just wondering, how are those discussions with CRA going right now in trying to review some of those contracts that, really are employee contracts instead of, I would say, contractors?
Mr. Conrad.
So yes, the Auditor General did raise that question around employer-employee issues. So I think you'll see in there that what they recommended is that we create a working group to look at the issue inside of government. So that's where we started. We haven't actually engaged with CRA yet, but we do have a cross-governmental working group. And in fact, I would say worth pointing out that the working group was originally created in response to the Auditor General's recommendation of last year for Communications Nova Scotia, where he found a couple of very specific individuals and suggested they look at those individuals. We created a working group that procurement was included on, that started some work in the spring of this year. And then when our audit came out, we broadened that working group to say, let's look more broadly at the issue. It is a fairly complex issue, employer-employee relationship. So if you go to Revenue Canada, they have a 10-item checklist that you run through that's got multiple questions around when may you or may you not be an issue. So, again, I think the Auditor General's finding specific to the contracts that he looked at was that in all 31 cases we were appropriately justified in using professional services, but did raise this issue around there may be times when we drift. So, you start with a professional services contract, and then maybe you renew it a time or two, and now you're into that world of, okay, is it still a contract, or is this more appropriate an employee relationship? So we've engaged the Department of Justice, the Department of Communication Nova Scotia, of course, ourselves, the Public Service Commission, to look at what are the criteria, what are the things we should be concerned about, how can we use the tools that we have to identify which employees across government might be at risk of this, so that we could then get to a place where we have a body of information that we could take to get some advice on, are we at risk or not. So we're in the early days of that process, I would say. We've had a couple of meetings, more meetings are planned through the fall, but we've got all the right players at the table. I think people have recognized the significance of the issue that the Auditor General has raised, and we're working our way towards finding, it is getting down to that kind of specific level of what questions do we need to ask and what advice do we need to get and what's it by. So.
All right, thank you. And it really does just roll around to the eligibility of EI and CPP contributions. In a lot of cases, if you're hiring a communication person, the province is providing the computer and sometimes the phone, and so it's a really gray line between what's a contractor and what's obviously an employee. So I'm hoping you're working with the Public Service Commission and trying to come up with that with CRA. So the contract, I think, that pops up in my mind and a lot of people's mind is the contract with the Deputy Minister of Planning and Priorities, Bernie Miller. It was talked about him being on a contract. So I'm just wondering, when the Premier's office was hiring Mr. Miller, did they use procurement at all to look at that contract? Because he was procured as a service contract.
Mr. Conrad.
So I would say, having worked with Mr. Miller for the last number of months, he's a tremendous asset to the province of Nova Scotia. We're lucky to have him in that role. Executive Council has the authority to make those kinds of individual service contracts with individuals, so they have a duly constituted authority to do that work, so they're able to do that work on their own.
So that's no. So I'm just wondering how is determined whether a contract should be reviewed. I mean, if procurement is supposed to be responsible for all procurement of services and products in the province, when does the department decide whether it should review something or not?
So there's a range of tools available to Sorry, Mr. Chair, I just jumped in.
That's fine.
There's a range of tools available in terms of the mechanisms by which the government does its business. One of the things that we've done is in terms of approving and accountability. In the generic question you're asking, how do we know, when do we look in? The Auditor General recommended that we establish a risk registry as one of the things that we might do, or that we should do, and in fact, this government, our minister, when coming to the position in internal services, was quite interested in how we could improve our accountability mechanisms. So the accountability mechanisms, one of the things we've put in place is an internal audit team focused on accountability. It's a small team, it's a couple of people who have started to work on internal audit issues related to accountability. So one of the things they will do for us is they're starting out with developing a risk registry. So not specific in any way to any individual contract, but they're starting with us in developing a risk registry, which will help us say, what are the areas we're at high risk of? What are the things we need to monitor? What are the things we need to pay attention to? What order should we be working on those things in? How do we move that forward? So it'll help us to better understand across the range of procurement issues that we have, how much time and effort should we be spending with municipal partners, how much should we be spending inside of government, how much should we be looking at goods, how much should we be looking at services, what are some of the high-risk areas that we may have. So we'll be looking forward to them bring us back a risk registry that will then in turn help us to look at what are the things that we need to focus on. And again, I would make sure I said that that's a very kind of generic framework they're doing. It's not specific to any one contract, but in kind of response to the government's interest in higher accountability and in response to the recommendation of the Auditor General.
So if we look at this, and I mean, Mr. Miller can be an example, but I think in general, when some of these things come into question, whether somebody should be getting CPP, should be getting EI, should be getting those kinds of things, whether they're employee or not employee, I believe that the province would have about a year to go back to CRA and say, hey, we're not too sure about this, could you give us a ruling on it? In Mr. Miller's case, we're gone past the year already. But is the CRA, is the working group looking at those particular things? What kind of time does the province have to truly decide whether they're employees or not employees?
Mr. Conrad.
So I have to admit I haven't heard a year time frame, so
Okay.
that's not a frame that I've been familiar with. I think the advice of the Auditor General was to engage the right players, get the right advice. So again, having Justice at the table, having the Public Service Commission at the table, really gives us the opportunity to get that good advice on what the time frames are, what the particular issues are that we should be addressing, how we would bring those forward. I'm quite confident that we'll get that positive advice before we get too deep into it. So I can't speak to a year. I'm sorry.
Sure. All right, well, thank you for that. I know I'm running out of time here. I know I've got a whole bunch of questions around Nova Star and Dennis Building and those kinds of things. So I guess I'll save those for after and move on to the NDP.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. D'Entremont. Ms. McDonald, we'll move to you now for 20 minutes.
Very much. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. This is a really important topic, although some people might find it dry in some ways. As someone who's been an MLA for a while, I have to tell you that, it is of great interest, particularly to the small business community in Nova Scotia and lots of business entities that are either doing business with government or who would like to do business with government, and who want a more transparent, accessible process, and one that they can feel is fair. So the work of doing anything we can to achieve those goals, and at the same time giving Nova Scotians value for dollar, is, I think, something we all share and are concerned about. Now, the background to this particular audit by the Auditor General, as you know, was previous audits that the AG's department had done, specifically around the Bluenose and the Colchester Hospital. Both of those really big projects with significant cost overruns and identified weaknesses in the management of those projects. And I think that the Auditor General tells us was the impetus for looking at smaller procurement and professional service contracts to get a handle on, what is the state of the oversight, the management, the consistency, the cost savings, the effectiveness, and what have you. But I have to say that given the current concerns about the VG Hospital, this is a really timely issue in terms of the lessons we've learned and how we're going to address problems around managing large projects, government expenditure, and the relationship with the private sector, because obviously building hospitals is not something that we do every day, and we don't necessarily have that expertise in-house. We're going to have to go outside, and so it makes it, I think, all the more important that we have really good systems in place to do that. So I'm going to ask a few questions about that, but I want to first just focus on the audit and some of the weaknesses that were identified in the audit. And I'm assuming that $255 million of expenditure last year by the province of Nova Scotia in this area, 45 million of that in the Department of Health. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of transactions, are we not? Do you have any idea? Can you provide the committee with a number that tells us how many transactions this relates to and how that would break down with respect to personal contracts versus procurement?
Mr. Conrad?
I'm not sure we have the an exact metric. We can certainly get that if the committee would like to have it. We could give you some better sense. I would think off the top of my head that my colleagues would agree, probably hundreds of, certainly, in terms of engagements and initiatives, spread across both goods and services. So it would be a range of things in the health authority. Here we're talking about services, so the professional services contracts. So this audit was specific to the professional services piece. So all of these contracts would be some form of a service contract, okay, right? So there is a personal services contract piece which falls outside of procurement. So these would be the professional service types contracts, but certainly in the hundreds, if not more, at that level.
Thank you. So we're essentially talking about those areas that the AG identified: engineering, management, consulting, project managers, marketing, advertising, that kind of thing.
Could include IT services, development of IT systems, strategic planning, business planning supports, but essentially, yes, those type of things.
So there were a number of things they identified. One of the things they identified were not having adequate language in contracts with respect to penalties in terms of time frames, bringing projects, bringing work in time, on schedule, on budget. And so that was one concern, and I think another concern was termination, inadequate termination or language, dispute resolution, no dispute resolution mechanisms in contracts, and there was one other area that escapes me at the moment, but certainly those three were, people who were authorizing the payment of invoices who did not have the information about what the ceiling was, okay, and so overpayments occurring, the lack of controls in terms of keeping the keeping the particular service contract within the budget that had been established. So those were all things that I picked up when I read the audit, and I'm wondering what has been done to address that.
Mr. Conrad.
So I'll ask Natalie McLean to make a few comments on this, because she's been very involved in the response, both in terms of how we position ourselves as well as the technology response to that. But I guess I would say, I certainly we would acknowledge that, and again, I would say one of the things that our minister has been focused on since he came to this position has been really trying to figure out how we do things like dispute resolution, as well as how we do vendor assessment through the course of the contract. So previously, while we often, of course, would have conversations with the buyers about how well a service was provided, we didn't have a good mechanism for documenting those and using those in response, which is one of the things that the audit picked up. So we've worked on two fronts there. One is to build in place some things around, or in the process of trying to figure out how do we do that. So we're working on a policy development piece, but we've also put in place some technology tools. So the technology tools really get us to things like being able to see in the system in real time when a contract was put in, when it was signed, who approved it, all those kinds of things. So maybe I'll let Natalie make a few comments about those pieces.
Ms. McLean?
Thank you. Since the time of the audit, we have put in place in our standard contract a clause around dispute settlement. So we have addressed one of the concerns already. As Jeff just mentioned, we have recently just implemented a new technology tool to help us with contract management. So what that tool does is it actually is a workflow tool to help us author and sign contracts. So we have much better control over where the contract is at any stage. Has it been signed? Has it not? Has the work begun? Has it not? And in today's world, we don't have that visibility. So certainly this tool, once it's up and running and fully implemented, will give us much better visibility into the system and where everything is with our contracts.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask you where the current requirements are with respect to the new Nova Scotia Health Authority around procurement and professional contracts. The act that was passed has provisions in it that indicate that school boards and district health authorities, municipal governments, and what have you are all subject to the terms of the Act. But if I read the Auditor General's report correctly, there was kind of maybe a grace period in the implementation of the requirements of that Act for some of these other entities. And at the time of the Act, of course, there was no one health authority. There were numerous health authorities. Now we have one. So, and this goes to my interest in how we move forward, for example, with some very large projects that could be coming up in the health authority, and what will be required of them, and whether or not your department will be involved in overseeing and working around procurement issues for engineering firms and consultants and all of this kind of thing that has is a piece of building new infrastructure.
Mr. Conrad.
That's a really rich question. So I would say there's maybe, I would identify in your question maybe three elements that there might be value in talking about. So one would be the question of what entities does the Procurement Act apply to in terms of our oversight into health authorities and school boards and others? What's the current relationship with health authority and school boards in terms of transfers? And I would maybe ask Mr. Mitchell to respond to those elements. If you had an interest, one of the recommendations, although it's not strictly a procurement issue, it definitely involves, is the management of those big major contracts and projects where procurement has a role, but also there's a role in terms of the technical advice where government has also made some moves. So if you want to pursue that, I'd be glad to speak to that. But maybe we'll start with, Chris could talk a little bit about the scope of the Procurement Act, as well as the moves that we've recently made with health authorities and school boards in terms of when they come into us and some of that kind of stuff.
Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you very much. As Jeff mentioned, so the Nova Scotia Health Authority, or the Department of Health, and the IWK-NSHA combination is now underneath the auspice of that Procurement Act. It came as a result of or it was enabled by the result of a study which was completed for all the folks inside of the current, what was 9 districts, now 4 zones, plus the headquarters piece of that. Everybody who was at the transactional level for running the warehouses, doing the actual purchases off of standing offers has remained with NSHA. The folks above that level who are engaged in the actual procurement piece of letting of RFPs, doing that sort of go to market, have been transferred over to my staff inside of the procurement cell inside of the ISD that Jeff is talking about. What's happened as a result of, and the answer to the question about what the larger procurements is, there's been a lot of great work done at a collaborative level between the NSHA leadership and the ISD leadership to ensure that NSHA is driving the bus. They are the folks who come up with the VP level leaders of each one of those particular programs or projects. When they come up, they have the input from the clinical side to make sure that that procurement is not driving the clinicians' decisions. So we have a really well-oiled collaborative process now between Alan Horsburgh's staff and my staff to ensure that we get what they're looking for as far as requirements. We build into that a procurement response to putting the shell together as far as how to get to market. That's the advice we provide back to the experts there. And then it's a very much collaborative, joined at the hip process as we go to market, both from decisions of what kind of process to use to go to market, then when we're in there, how to do the negotiations or how to get through the actual tendering process with the vendors who are out there, and then to the close piece of that, and then we do the management for them as far as when the actual contract is in place. So from the NSHA perspective, it's already up and running. It's already a very collaborative working process. It's brand new, so we're working our way through the details of how to get it, and so each one that we go through, we learn a little bit more, we tweak the process that we're at. With respect to the Nova Scotia school boards and the MASH sector outside of that, you're absolutely correct. There's a sort of a pause, or a phase 1 was Nova Scotia Health. Phase 2 will take in the Nova Scotia school board entities in the 16-17 fiscal year. Lots of good discussions already ongoing with the Nova Scotia School Board. We had them engaged in the definition process for the tool which Natalie was discussing, the Ariba tool. So they're very much engaged in that. They have some other trying things going on right now with internal review processes, so they weren't, even if we had wanted to, they weren't quite ready to join into that. So the deal we've had with them on a collaboration basis again is in the 16-17 we'll get to a point of bringing them on much the same as we have from the Nova Scotia Health. The difference will be I won't gain any personnel from Nova Scotia school board entities, so we need to get the process up functioning efficiently so that we can actually begin to find some spare capacity and bring on additional clients.
Thank you. How many staff transferred over from the DHA into your unit?
Mr. Mitchell?
So there was actually 21 full-time equivalent positions. Of those, 15 of them actually had people in them and 6 were vacant. So 15 folks from the above that transactional level were actually transferred over to procurement, ISD procurement from the NSHA. And we've only just completed that transfer of people really seriously as recently as last week. We got the last one. There are 2 who remain unable to transfer over, but we're tracking those ones. Otherwise, we've gotten the completion of the transferred individuals and positions over.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, the Auditor General also raised something. I'm so happy. Thank you. You raised this. The $5,000 limit or floor, I guess you would go. Anything above $5,000 requires ministerial approval, which was a directive from Treasury Board, I think when I was health minister. And so you can imagine in a Department of Health with a budget of $3.5 billion, how many $5,000 approvals a minister is asked to, my workload just exploded, not that it wasn't large enough already. So the Auditor General raised this number as not as a concern, but just as, I think, a suggestion that perhaps that ceiling or that floor, however we want to look at it, be examined. And I'm wondering if that has been examined, if it's going to be examined, if there will be a change. And if there is, what will the new amount be? Because I think prior to that, it might have been 25,000, maybe? I'm not sure.
Mr. Conrad.
Yeah, that predates me, so I'm not sure what the ceiling or floor was prior to. I don't know that. So I would say at this point, no, we haven't yet tackled that issue. It's not specifically one of the, although raised in the audit for sure, it wasn't specifically one of the recommendations. Given the, as you can appreciate, the range of other things we have on the go, the recommendations, the transitions that Chris and Natalie have talked about in terms of the moving to the new Ariba tool, the transitions of staff, some of those issues that we're trying to deal with, it really hasn't been kind of a top of mind issue for us. I would say that it is somewhat, the workload impact is somewhat departmental specific, as you can imagine, right? The amount of buy that would require those kinds of approvals in a department like energy versus a department like health would probably be fundamentally different in terms of how much is flowing through for those kinds of things. So it's not an issue we've tackled yet. It's one we've been aware of. There's been conversations. It is, as you say, technically a Treasury Board issue. It's not a procurement issue. So it's a place where we are bound by the Treasury Board directive. I know that Treasury Board has been talking about it. We've been talking about a number of efficiency measures that we could put in place that may well end up there. But no, it's not one that we've tackled yet. Nor do we have a proposal on what a new number would be. We just haven't gotten to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The last question, because my time is almost up here, is with respect to the concern that the Auditor General did raise around possible liabilities. I'm going to read directly from his report. We also identified a possible liability to the province based on individuals being hired and treated as self-employed contractors when the terms of their arrangements make it difficult to distinguish them from provincial employees. And my colleague has already raised this with respect to one contract that has been in the news recently, and that's Mr. Miller's. And I want to say right at the outset, because Jeff, you know, you mounted a very rigorous defense of Mr. Miller, which I would completely agree with. You know, I don't think it's in dispute or anyone is suggesting for a moment that he's not an asset or skilled or capable or even a nice guy. That really isn't the issue. The issue is the unusual nature of the contract, not as an employee, but as a contractor. And coincidentally, this is something that that the Auditor General has raised as a potential liability.
Order. I do apologize, but the time
We'll
has
come
expired.
back to.
We'll move to Mr. Rankin in the Liberal Caucus. Mr. Rankin.
Thank you. I'd just like to learn where specifically you can identify where savings are coming from with this whole transformation and consolidation. Is it more to do with the scale, the economies of scale that we're able to achieve through that consolidation, or is it more to do with less duplication, perhaps less FTEs looking at the same types of contracts? Just wonder if you can explain that, and if possible, maybe give just a rough estimate of annual savings to the province.
Mr. Mitchell.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think the answer to your first question is both. I think it comes from an amassing of subject matter expertise in one place so that we can begin to get better at it. We can begin to look after more of the departments that otherwise would have done it off the edge of the desk or would have done it as a part of what their responsibility was, but not a complete focus to what their attention was. So by bringing them all together underneath a central procurement agency, we have allowed the amassing of that kind of intellect. Added to that, though, in this first building kind of year that we're in right now, we're also getting to a place where the folks who are in here, we're educating them better. We're teaching them how to strategically view different kinds of commodities, to actually get some better information from SAP, and hopefully, as a result of the tool, the Ariba tool, which we've just had go live, we'll get an opportunity to much more, we will educate the decisions better as to how we will actually complete procurement activity in the future. So that's kind of the better people in the same place with better education or better information. The second part of that, though, is, as you mentioned, the contract management piece. So we will, as a result, again, of that tool, or which will enable that, the ability to take a look at the contracts which exist, to start to identify the 9 contracts for the same item in 9 different places, sometimes all from the same vendor at different prices. We'll get smarter at that, and we'll be able to start driving the vendor community to dealing with government as a single entity rather than multiple entities over multiple areas. So it's the combination of becoming better at strategically identifying what to go after because there's savings available, and then it's that cleansing or cleanup of the contracts which currently exist in the government overall, to start to identify where the efficiencies are, where we're getting better prices, and we can start to have other people button onto existing contracts.
Okay, and I didn't get a figure yet, but maybe you can answer that in the next question. I'm just wondering, are those competencies transferable to the various other sectors? We talked about the MASH sector, but also I'm just wondering, the agencies like the liquor agency and perhaps NSBI, or the long list of different public sector agencies, is that going to be, how is that going to be achieved? And the AG notes that there's not enough testing of these types of entities, and it wasn't reported how they're going to follow up. So I'm just wondering why that's the case, and how are we going to achieve effectiveness on those types of entities that are arm's length from government?
Mr. Conrad.
So maybe from a money perspective, if you go back and start, we started a couple of years ago, again, predates even the creation of the department, but we started a couple of years ago with some strategic sourcing initiatives to try out some of this work, and then have found that worked well, and have moved into into this new structure and arrangement. So, our belief is that over our studies, our work shows us that over the course of a 5 to 6 year period, we think we can drive out about $50 million annually in expense across the $1.6 billion worth of spending that's done between government and the health authorities. So, it's a fairly big build, and Chris has talked about some of the tools and mechanisms by which we would do that. So, it's an ambitious goal, but we believe we're going to get there. We're on target. We've had a little bit of challenge in the startup. We thought we'd have people transferred over in April, and they came in July. So, as with many of these big projects, we're under the gun, but we still have great confidence. We have a great relationship with the health authority. As Chris talked about, they are as committed to this project as we are. So we believe we're going to get there. In terms of the transferability and kind of the ability to support others, again, I don't know if Chris or Natalie want to speak to that, but there's lots of engagement by us with some of those other partners around the provision of advice and guidance and learning, as well as the places where we provide direct support like we do with the health authorities. So there's opportunity to reach in both ways. I mean, we're pretty open shop around what we learn and wanting to transfer it along to the system and share with people best practices and approaches. And in fact, Chris is involved in a number of regional committees and work groups, and maybe you could talk a little bit, Chris, about how we share some of that info.
Mr. Mitchell?
Thanks very much. I think before we do it, the biggest way that we're going to be able to transfer that ability to the school boards and to the MASH sectors is twofold. One is if we create province-wide contracts, which then allow them to be able to use those contracts at a better price than they would be able to solicit on their own from a smaller base, then that will gain from them, and it'll drive some efficiencies for them. The other piece, though, and we haven't really touched on it a lot, is the policy which Natalie's shop has been putting together, and which we hope to get released. It's under development still, but we hope to get released fairly shortly. Will drive a number of interesting things. Some of those are just changes to the way that we go to market under negotiated RFPs versus what you would understand to be the normal everybody RFP. So we're going to get to a place where we can select specific vendors in advance of going to market. We're going to have opportunities to do negotiations with vendors once we're already in the play. So all of those will help to drive efficiencies that, to be honest, most people have expected of the public service to be able to get a better deal than they've actually been able to realize. And so many of these things will provide that tool in which to arm our ability to deal with the vendor community and get a better return, a more transparent, but a better return for the government and for the dollars that are spent.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Stroink.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming here today. I guess as my colleagues have touched on small businesses a bit and the procurement process, can you just kind of quickly walk me through what a small business would have to do to follow into a procurement process with the government?
Ms. McLeod? Ms. McLean?
Thank you. This is an area that we are actually particularly proud of, and the work we do in trying to engage our supplier community here in Nova Scotia. In fact, many other jurisdictions from across Canada look to us and some of the things that we've implemented here and try to replicate those back in their home provinces. We do everything from really informal one-on-one meetings with folks. We try to introduce suppliers to end purchasers out in departments. And we do everything up to a large event we have every year. This year we're holding one at, it's actually upcoming October 27th. It's called the Reverse Trade Show. We invite the supplier community in to meet public sector buyers. It's well attended every year. We have usually around 300 suppliers come through the doors. And we have probably 30 to 40 different public sector entities set up booths. And so the suppliers come in and shop around their goods and services and let buyers know what it is they have to offer. So we do a whole wide range of things. We do a lot of targeted seminars. We partner with federal government. We partner with different municipalities, chambers of commerce. So we really try and get out there and spread the word about government procurement to create awareness about it. We also have a number of tools in place. We have something called the Tender Opportunities Notification Service. That's a service by which suppliers can register to get emails in their inbox every morning based on certain categories of goods and services that they select. And we currently have about 3,300 subscribers to that service. We also have a Twitter feed, so every day we tweet out all of our tenders, and we have about 1,300 followers on Twitter. So we try as best we can to spread the word and encourage business to bid on all these opportunities. Our tender notices site, it's mandatory that all public sector entities in the province use our site to post their tender notices. And we do have over almost 4,000 tenders get posted there on an annual basis.
Thank you. I just follow up on that kind of questions. How many, the percentage of procurements that happen in Nova Scotia, what would be the percentage that's actually going to local companies here in Nova Scotia?
Mr. Conrad?
So we track on an annual basis the percentage. We generally are in the 80% range. I think at the moment we're tracking around 75 to 78% for this year. So it's an imprecise science in some ways to track exactly who you would consider a Nova Scotia company and who someone else would consider a Nova Scotia company. But to the degree that we can, we try to track, and we're quite proud of the fact that generally about 80%.
That's great news. I guess kind of follow up on that. I guess at the end of all this, I mean, it's up to the small businesses to make sure that their pencil's sharp enough in order to win the contracts. And I guess with the new shared services plan, do you find that payment is much quicker than maybe in the past, sort of thing? Because I mean, most small businesses wouldn't be able to carry the debt load for 60 to 90 days, right? With the new process, do you find that they're getting paid much quicker?
I guess a couple of things. So one, from a procurement perspective, I think all the processes that we put in place, one of the things we have in mind is certainly burden on individual companies and businesses. I think you're all aware that this government has put in place a regulatory reform team to help look at some of those things. So we recently met with some of the folks the Deputy Ministers Committee met with some senior folks in the regulatory review team, and one of the areas we identified some opportunity to work on was things like procurement processes where we can do some regulatory regulatory review to try and speed all of these things up. The other piece, one of the other pieces in shared services is we've taken on the responsibility for financial transactions on behalf of government. So in addition to the work we're doing on the procurement side, we also have a team that are responsible for kind of the bill paying of government, and they're working on things like electronic fund transfer and streamlining payment systems. And the system that we've been talking about this morning, the Ariba system, actually has a second component to it, which links our procurement pay system to our pay system. So as we move further and further down the road with our technological implication, we will tie together the procurement side and the payment side, which will get us to two things. One, it gets us to the Auditor General's response, which I think one of your colleagues raised, which was paying invoices based on the invoice instead of on the contract. So we'll now be able to look in real time and see the contract values when we pay the invoice. But it will also get us to that speed of service. We'll have electronic processing from the day that the order goes in to the day the payment is made, which will speed us along. Anything you would want to add? Okay. I got that right, I think.
Hopefully you can teach the federal government some tricks. I'll pass it on.
Ms. Miller.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to say I think it's a good news story today. Now that we're learning that the Department of Internal Services, we know that they're doing the job it was intended to. We're saving the taxpayers lots of money, so that's really a good thing. I'm a real advocate for buying local, supporting local, so it's great news for my colleague to bring that forward, that, you know, over 75%, whatever, up to 80% are local companies that you're dealing with. But my question too is, in dealing with tenders, or if you have, you know, 3 applicants for a job and one's local and 2 aren't local, how much more weight does that carry in your department to be a local company?
So,
Mr. Conrad.
I could turn that over to Natalie. I think one of the things I would say, just in framing that, is a couple of things, I guess. One would be, you know, we are constantly working in terms of the balance, I think that someone talked about earlier, around, you know, the value for money and the ability to support local. So it's always that, you know, people are excited by saving $50 million and challenged by you get that out by trying to amalgamate things together and do bigger buys and some of that. So that balance is really something that we're constantly thinking about in terms of the go forward. And then the other thing I mentioned earlier, one of the findings for me was the complexity of the world, and things like some of the trade and buy agreements that we have really drive us to levels where we have, you know, where we're required to do certain things. So maybe I'll let Natalie talk a little more technically around how we're able to do the buy local work in addition to the marketing to make sure people are in the game. What are some of the constraints and opportunities that we have in the side of the frameworks that we work within?
Ms. McLean.
Sure. Thanks. I won't bore you too much about trade agreements, but certainly, as Jeff alluded to, we operate under a number of different trade agreements, which really, at certain thresholds, certain dollar thresholds, we have to treat suppliers the same. So we can't show preferences for Nova Scotia suppliers at certain dollar thresholds. So for example, a simple example would be for goods. So right now, government departments are in an agreement, the Atlantic Procurement Agreement. At $10,000, we have to treat all Atlantic Canadian suppliers the same. At $25,000, we have to treat all Canadian suppliers the same. So we can't start showing preferential treatment for Nova Scotia suppliers at those thresholds. Now, in our policy, as it's worded today, we have something called reciprocity. So in Ontario, this gets complicated, so excuse me if it's too complicated, but in Ontario, they publicly tender at $25,000 for goods. We do it at 10. Ontario bids into our contract for 10,000, and they're number 1. In our policy, we have language that would allow us to go to number 2 or to number 3 if it was a Nova Scotia or even an Atlantic Canadian supplier. So we generally leave that decision up to the department based on, you know, the dollar amount and if they determine that to be best value.
That's really good news. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
You have about 4.5 minutes left.
Okay, well then I have one more question. So can you tell me a little bit more about your new assessment policies?
Mr. Conrad?
As how we assess bids and winning bids? Okay, sure. So I'll turn this over to my colleagues. I guess one of the things I would say is, again, when you look at the range of complexity that we have when we're assessing programs and services, it's a fairly wide range in terms of the way you would assess a contract where you're going to the market for a simple good. So we're going out to buy paper. Obviously, as long as you can meet a minimum criteria, we may be assessing past the minimum criteria, and then you're assessing on price point versus the complexity of going to the market for a really complex service or product or something like that. So with that frame, any volunteers? Mr. Mitchell has volunteered to do the more technical side.
And
Mr. Mitchell.
if I get this wrong, I'll pass it back to Natalie. How's that? But as Jeff mentioned, so it's really about a joint responsibility from the department who's going to go to market and the procurement folks who are going to provide the advice. The larger ones, there's 3 or 4 really large ones which are going on now, everything from the ASD, Service Nova Scotia piece with registries that was mentioned earlier, to the one person, one record. So generally what I've been able to do is with the department which we're assisting's approval, we put somebody, a technical expert, on their committee which is helping them design what piece, how to get to market, what's the best way to look at it, what will the market support from a knowledge versus a price point. Do you want to put more, as Jeff was mentioning, do you want to put more emphasis on, if it's very complex, you have to pass a certain threshold point on the capability and then you go to a price point. But we're also getting much, much more innovative on blending the two of those together, taking a look at whether you can get into that rack and stack of the best combination threshold of technical capability and price, and then dropping that down into, okay, if I go below that, do I bump the price up to get a better product or do I not? So we're building those kind of innovative ways at how to get to the market right into the policy, which we're hopefully going to be releasing shortly.
Okay. Ms. Lonis-Croft?
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you. I wasn't expecting to get time in this round. Procurement is very interesting to me, and in light of all the issues with the Blue Nose, I believe I've been sent every procurement contract by constituents, so I've really looked them over closely. And I've found it very interesting to find out about the hospitals and the school boards in my work too. And I'm really pleased to see that that's now being handled by your department and their future plans to take more of that on. I am a little curious about the subcontracts. Like TIR has subcontracts for snow removal and lawn care and whatnot of some properties that are owned by the province. Do you have anything to do with reviewing those?
Mr. Conrad?
So there's a range of, I guess I would, there are some of the contracts you referenced. So for example, lawn care and building maintenance is actually, some of those things are actually in our department. So the property maintenance contracts, those would be tendered publicly. You'll see over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks, for example, you'll start to see the contracts go out for winter snow plowing in government-owned properties. Those will go out publicly for properties that we own across the province. Some of the other contracts, a subcontract, so if TIR goes out and contracts for a major project, they're paving a road, and then the contractor who witnesses subcontracting to another entity to truck in goods or services. I'd have to look to my colleagues. I don't know that we have direct oversight into those subs. We work with the main contractor who has a responsibility to work with the subs, I believe.
Still have time?
There are just 10 seconds remaining.
Oh, I'll save the next question for the second round.
Okay. We'll move back to Mr. D'Entremont and the PC Caucus for 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I do want to go back for a few moments on the issue of contract management, contract employees, and specifically with Mr. Miller's contract. And just to go to the Canada Revenue Agency issue, if you go to page 58 of the Auditor General's report, recommendation, or actually item 4.51, toward the end of that paragraph. If the Canada Revenue Agency considers these individuals employees, the province is liable for Canada Pension Plan and employee insurance deductions. It should have withheld it should have withheld from these contractors, as well as the employees' matching amounts and interest or fines accruing. So I'm just wondering, in light of that, will the department review Mr. Miller's contract?
Mr. Conrad.
So again, my understanding is that certainly the Executive Council has the authority to make the kinds of arrangements they've made for individuals that they're staffing. So at this point, I'm not aware of any intent to seek Revenue Canada assistance with Mr. Miller's contract. I believe that the Executive Council had the authority to construct the contract the way they did, that they've been followed the due diligence that they're required to follow, and we're not involved or engaged in any discussions with Revenue Canada on that file.
All right. So I'm also thinking, though, if something's being done contrary to policy of the CRA, which is almost, I guess, illegal, because common Nova Scotian can't go awry of Canada Revenue Agency policies or rules. So when we know about these things, isn't it incumbent upon us to inform others that they should be looking at these things? So as deputy of the department, would you be consulting with your minister to say, listen, we should be looking into this? It's not your duty.
Mr. Conrad.
Thank you. So again, I think when you go back to the Auditor General's comments, the recommendation was that we form a committee or form a working group to have a look at what are the conditions under which we would have concerns and where should we seek advice and guidance. As I've indicated earlier, we're in the process of creating that committee. Again, we would be looking at places where we believe that there's reason to think that for one reason or another, again, my experience would be in general it is an intentional drift from professional services into some other type of arrangement. That's the most common reason we'd be looking into that. We've taken that seriously. We have that working group established and started to do work, which would include folks from the Public Service Commission and others that have more expertise than we have on the types of arrangements that are being made, which ones are ones that we maybe should be thinking about in terms of whether they are ones that would be at risk. We would want to develop some kind of generic conversation and framework which we could then put out to departments to take on a discussion about where might we have ones that are at risk and what should we be doing about those. At the moment, we're not using Mr. Miller's contract in response to that. We're more generically looking at what are the opportunities, what are the places where we have risks that we would identify.
All right. Well, I guess once again we'll have to call on the Premier to look at this one, because it does concern us that that Mr. Miller's contract and the way he's been contracted or employed by the province is actually contrary to CRA rules, and that shouldn't be happening. So let's move on to the Novastar for a minute. Of course, we know that, or at least we hope that internal services and procurement process has been involved in the whole Yarmouth Ferry issue. We know that there was an RFP put out, a call for bids has been, I would say, not completed, but at least 4 bids have come in. So I'm just wondering what involvement the Department of Internal Services or procurement has been involved in the whole Novastar issue.
So again, as you've said, the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal is the lead entity on the replacement for the Yarmouth Ferry, and has gone out for RFPs. Certainly TIR, I would say, is one of our more experienced departments in terms of how they work with some of these contracts, these big infrastructure type agreements and these big types of agreements. So they're pretty well versed, have quite a bit of their own capacity in terms of how they move out on those things. So while we have had some conversations, there's been some discussions in terms of advice and guidance and those things. Certainly the lead agency on that would be TIR. But
you are providing some kind of consulting service to them?
Yes, and I would, again, it's, given, it's one of those issues where given the capacity of the individual department and the uniqueness of any given contract, there are some where we would be much more engaged than others. This is one, I think, where they run a number of ferry services. They're regularly in market for boats and services. They may not need the kind of day-to-day engagement from us that other departments that are doing more unique and leading-edge kinds of conversations where we might assign someone on a much more intense kind of basis. So yeah, I think there's been engagement, but we're not the lead agency.
That's fine.
Yeah.
moving over to the Dennis building for a minute, I'm just wondering who that project belongs to. I know your minister spoke to this a number of times, so the tender on gutting the Dennis building was issued, and that I think the process is complete, but I'm not sure. So I'm just wondering, is it your issue or is it a transportation infrastructure renewal issue?
I guess it depends on the question you're asking. So specific to the tender for removing the regulated goods, that was done through my department. So my department has responsibility for helping government, in addition to the procurement side, on the side of the house around environmental services and supports. We support government with technical expertise around environmental remediation and things like that. So that particular RFP went through my department, and in fact I got an update just a couple of days ago. They've been a little bit delayed, but we're expecting in October they'll be done. In fact, I walked past the building on my way down today, and they were carrying taped yellow bags out of the building and loading them in a dumpster. The disposal or final distribution of what will happen with the Dennis building itself is actually a TIR issue. So Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal has responsibility for the acquisition and disposal of government property. So that's all I meant. That side of the equation would be with TIR.
Okay,
We're involved in the discussions, but it's technically TIR.
All right. So the Minister of Internal Services has previously suggested that he would issue an RFP to redevelop the building. But again, this sort of falls into two places, I think, from what your last answer was, is that it's a little bit of TIR because it might be a disposal issue or actually a redevelopment. So do you know if there's discussions ongoing whether an RFP will be led on the redevelopment of that site?
Mr. Conrad.
Yeah, there are absolutely discussions ongoing around the process we would follow to define the redevelopment. There's no question on that. So I think it's an active file. Part of the reason we did the remediation, or the main reason we did the remediation work that we did, was to position the building for best and highest use by someone. So whether they, ultimately demolish or whatever, all of these goods, regulated goods that are in there, all regulated issues, had to be dealt with, and we felt by dealing with those in our hands, we could position it to get done. So, as we come into the October period and that piece is done, there's absolutely conversations underway regarding what the next step will be and how that will be dealt with. I can't speak to exactly what point those are at, but I'm aware that there are conversations underway and that we can expect in the next, I would think, couple of months that there will be some movement on that.
So I would guess the regulated items that have been removed from there, asbestos, moldy, whatever,
lead
those
paint,
kinds of things.
Yeah, asbestos.
So with all those things removed, will we be heating that this year? I'm guessing that's probably the end game, that we don't have to heat it. But how are we going to make that determination now that probably insulation has been hauled out, and walls have been hauled out? So I'm going to guess we're not going to heat that this year.
Correct. We've stopped the heat to the building, and indeed that was part of the overall process was by moving the records that were still stored in the building. So even after staff moved out, there were records still stored in the building. So we've located alternative storage facilities for those. We've moved the records out of the building, torn out the plaster and the plumbing and the pipes and all of the things which might have caused problems in terms of not having heat in the building, which will reduce our expenses for government, both in terms of the heating and maintenance side of the building, but also in terms of things like security. So when records were in the building, we still had a commissioner on site to protect the records so nobody could get in. We'll no longer be required to expend those costs as well.
So I guess we're just hopefully we'll hear something soon of what's going to happen to the next step, because I mean the next step is looking over at that old building is going to be a large and expensive one. So whether it gets redeveloped or not, I guess is of course a government question whether it's going to happen or not. I wanted to move quickly over to more of a local issue, but I know it's got the same kind of issues across the province as I talked to other MLAs. And this is from an article on September 21st, I believe. April 17th. New agreement concerns school boards where higher cost, delays, exclusion of local businesses all cited. So this was an article in the Courier, the Digby Courier. And it was basically the Tri-County School Board that was, or at least a member of that school board, Elizabeth Acker, when it came to losing the latitude to buy locally, I guess is the way she looks at it. And I've heard things like this, like if you need a part for an international bus, you need to go through the one supplier that we have, probably in Bridgewater. And even though there's an international dealer in Sydney and you're in Sydney, or there's one in Digby, but you can't go grab it. And it might be a $5 part, but you have to get it couriered over for a $20 charge. So so where do those concerns get addressed by school boards, especially when it comes to purchasing small items and even larger items too?
Mr. Conrad?
Let me pass that to you. Thank you. Again, this would go back to that balance question that we talked about earlier and some of the strategic sourcing initiatives that are underway. So one of the things we try to do is we try to break up some of the contracts in ways that allow for local vendors to participate. But one of the things that's really important in terms of the strategic sourcing work that we do in terms of saving government money is to get to standardization. So buses would be a great example, light-duty vehicles would be another example. One of the findings of the work that we did is when we did the work and said, what are some of the cost drivers for government to own a fleet of half-ton trucks which are made up of 5 different companies and stock parts in stock rooms for 5 different types of vehicles. All of those things drive up costs because you have an inconsistency across the system. So it's a kind of multi-part question, but one of the things we've done is try to standardize where we can to the contract items. The other part is the service side of that. So on the service side, while we've standardized on some of the standards in terms of the purchase and where we purchase from, we've tried to break the service contract agreements up to allow for some level of local engagement in the service provision, which would allow for things like local dealers to do service work and provide some of those minor parts. And maybe Mr. Mitchell could just speak if he has anything to add to that.
Mr. Mitchell?
I was going to until you answered the entire question, but the point is it's always that constant balance between how much would you like to get locally with potentially an incrementally higher price, or how much would you like to benefit from a slightly more regional delivery capability. It's always a balance between the small supplier in a local region versus the ability to get a larger, more strategically driven procurement. So it's one which we take full knowledge of each time we go through a strat sourcing process. So yeah, we keep it in mind each time we do that.
And I think what Steve Stoddard, who's the Director of Operations for the Tri-County School Board, he said that it adds up roughly about 19% to the board's cost in this particular case when it comes to office products, furniture, technology services, vehicle parts and maintenance. And it really revolves around courier services, delivery costs, and those kinds of things. So I'm just, maybe thought for later on is just try to find that balance between having the responsibility to the taxpayer in Nova Scotia, but at the same time trying to find a better deal across the way. So just one particular issue that I was concerned about in my area.
Order. The time has expired. We'll move to Ms. McDonald in the NDP for 14 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks very much. I want to come back to where I had left off when I ran out of time, which was around the contract with the Deputy Minister for Policy and Priorities. Now, you've indicated that Executive Council has the authority and not your department. So I want to ask you a few questions around that. In preparation for today's hearing, did you have any discussion with anyone from Executive Council regarding personal service contracts or CRA requirements or any aspects of the Auditor General's report and whether or not that matter might arise?
Mr. Conrad?
So one of the things I would say is getting ready for these, we want to do our best job we can in conversations related to the public accounts and the accountability. So we've certainly had conversations, as I've indicated, around the employer-employee relationship issues and those kinds of issues with a whole range of folks. There's been conversations, so, in anticipation of some of the questions, I asked some questions just to make sure that Executive Council had the authority and had followed the requirements that they had required, and was assured that they have, in fact, followed the processes and have executive authority to undertake the work that they did. I believe everybody believes that the work has been appropriately managed and appropriately put in place. Again, where our focus is really on, I did not talk about CRA rulings specific to that contract with anyone. So, but again, our focus has really been on the recommendation of the Auditor General around identifying where in the system we may have a broader kind of conversation and issue.
Thank you for that response, but that actually wasn't the question. The question was, did you have any discussions with anyone from Executive Council with respect to the sections of the Auditor General's report around the potential violations of CRA requirements in terms of personal service contracts? That's the question, not specific to Mr. Miller's contract, but in terms of the larger issue and whether or not that might come up and what the response should be or could be.
Mr. Conrad?
Sorry, I didn't mean to evade. I clearly misunderstood your question. No, I had no such discussion related specifically to CRA and personal services contracts with anyone from the Executive Council office. Again, we've talked to a range of folks, but not anyone from the Executive Council office on that topic.
To your knowledge, does Executive Council have the legal authority to override requirements of the Canadian Revenue Agency?
I would assume not, but you're asking me questions that are outside my area of jurisdiction. I can't answer that.
Thank you. You're in the employ of the province as a deputy minister, as an individual. I'm assuming you have a contract as an employee of the province, and most of the other deputy ministers have similar contracts, correct?
In fact, no. I'm an order in council appointment. I'm essentially a lifelong civil servant. I worked for the federal government for 20 years, now 10 with the provincial government. I'm an order in council appointment. I don't have an individual contract myself.
Okay, but you are an employee of the province.
I am an employee of the province.
So I have the CRA guidelines. I wouldn't really call them guidelines. They're kind of an information sheet that they provide to employers, employees, others, to help people determine whether they're an employee or whether they're a self-employed individual. So they're very interesting. So indicators that show that the worker is a self-employed individual would be things like this. The worker is usually free to work when and for whom he or she chooses and may provide his or her services to different payers at the same time. The worker does not have to perform the services personally. He or she can hire another party to either complete the work or help complete the work. The worker can generally choose the time and the manner the work will be performed. The worker does not need to be at the payee's premises. The worker can accept or refuse work from the payer. The working relationship between the payer and the worker does not present a degree of continuity, loyalty, security, subordination, or integration, all of which are generally associated with an employer-employee relationship. I find these indicators interesting. I doubt very much that most deputy ministers would be in a position to accept or refuse work from the payer or don't need to attend work on the payer's premises. However, these are the indicators showing that the worker is an employee. The payer directs and controls many elements of how the work is performed. The payer controls the worker's absences, such as sick leave or vacation. The payer controls the worker with respect to the work and the method used to do the work. I'm not going to go through all of these. Maybe I'll just table this document with the clerk. So my question would be this, because the Auditor General has raised this, not just, he hasn't raised it with respect to Mr. Miller's contract. He's raised it with respect to other personal services contracts. But this could have implications as well for Mr. Miller's contract, I would say. So this document indicates, and the Auditor General has indicated, that there are expectations for employers and employees in an employment relationship to contribute to the Canada Pension Plan, the Employment Insurance Program. Those are legislated requirements in employment relationships, and that there are penalties and fines. Are you aware of what the penalties and fines might be for an employer or an employee who fails to adhere to the requirements of the federal government and CRA?
Mr. Conrad?
The material that you're reviewing there, I believe, would be some of the same material that we're reviewing in our advisory group that's working on the employer-employee relationship issue. So again, as you can see, it's a complex issue. In addition to those things that you point out, which are absolutely in that list, are things like, is there a contract in place? What was the understanding of the parties coming into the agreement? Which is why this becomes a blurry line, and the Auditor General has raised the question around where that line is and how we make sure we better understand it. Specific to your question, no, I have to say that I'm not aware of what the penalties are from the Canada Revenue Agency related to employer-employee relationship. It's not something that we've, or certainly that I've been pursued or been briefed on as yet.
Thank you. Is there anyone inside the public service on a personal service contract that spans a period of 3 to 4 years that you're aware of?
Mr. Conrad?
So personal services contracts do not fall under the Procurement Act. Professional services contracts would, so I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that, again, one of the issues in the professional services contract that's been raised, and I think has caused the concern from the Auditor General, is that we do have these circumstances where we've appropriately brought someone in under a professional services contract for a short period of time, and over a period of time we've gradually lengthened that contract. Another project has come along, we've brought the same person in on a second project. I'm not sure of the total length of some of those, but I believe that length of engagement on the professional services side would be one of the concerns that's caused the Auditor General to say you should have a second look, or a more astute look. But on the personal services side, I'm afraid I don't know the answer. That would be probably more in the world of the Public Service Commission than internal services.
So just one final question on this, and then I'll turn it to the time to my colleague. To be clear, this working group that that's been established in your department will not, as part of its work, look at the contract that the Premier has with his Deputy Minister for Policy and Priorities. That's the position of your department. That will not be looked at.
Mr. Conrad?
At this point, the working group is still at the stage of identifying, again, to some of the things you read out, what are some of those risk factors, where are the places in government that we may have some risks, what are some of the specific people contracts that we would want to look at. We're not at the stage of identifying any individual contract. So I guess I was just trying to be clear earlier when I said our group has not been established specifically to look at that contract. We've been established in relationship to the contract. We have not identified, or sorry, to the audit. We have not yet identified how we're even going to review and identify which contracts are of issue. So at this point, no, the working group does not have a plan to look at that specific contract, but then we don't have a plan to look at, we haven't identified any individual contract as yet.
Has
that we're
the working
concerned about.
group met?
The working group has had either 1 or 2 meetings in the spring and will be coming back together in the course of the next short while. So there was kind of a summer recess as people were away and that kind of thing, but we'll be coming back together into the fall.
So am I correct in saying that I hear you say there is a possibility that this contract could in fact be looked at by the committee?
Mr. Conrad?
I would say based on my information that I have at the moment, my understanding is that the contract is duly constituted. It is appropriate given the authorities of Executive Council. I'm not aware of any reason why we would identify that specific contract at this point. But again, we haven't identified which contracts we're going to look at, but I'm not aware that that contract would be the focus of a review by this committee at this point. Again, I'm not completely familiar with the contract, but my understanding is it's duly constituted and it's not one of the ones that would have raised these types of questions for the committee. So, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McDowell. Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, and I know I have about a minute, so quickly go back to one of the issues around what's on the horizon, and that's on a big project like the replacement of the Centennial Building. What role, or does your department have a role in overseeing that type of project, or would that totally be in another area? Just so I'm a bit clear on your role if that proceeds.
Mr. Conrad?
That is a good question. So 2 things. One, I guess our department would in fact have roles to play. So in these large procurement contracts, we would see the likelihood that we would assign probably a procurement staff person, depending on the nature of how they went out and how they split that work up. I would anticipate that should a project like that go forward, we would probably assign a procurement specialist to that file on whatever level of support was needed to make sure that they get the work done. If I had the time to slide it in, I guess I would say in response to some of the earlier recommendations from those 2 earlier audits of the Auditor General, one of the recommendations was that government establish a group who has capacity to manage those large projects. So one of the shared services initiatives which happened was to move the building project staff from the Department of Health and Wellness and from the Department of Education into the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. So Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal now has a team who has the expertise to do those major construction projects. Essentially, the line we've drawn is about $1 million. So if it's a project of, there's some other boundaries, you know, if you're installing a $1 million boiler, maybe the board will do that itself. But roughly $1 million project would stay with either the health authority or the board. Anything over $1 million would come into Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, who would have that project expertise in managing major projects. So whether it's a health authority, a school board, or a government department, they now have a group as of April 1st that is focused on those very large projects. So between them, with their expertise in engineering and design and project contract maintenance and all of that, and us with our procurement expertise, government is much better positioned to manage those big projects than we have been in the past. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Conrad. Wanted to make sure you had a chance to get that answer in. We'll move now to the final segment of questioning to Ms. Lonis Croft.
Okay, thank you. Going back to my area of questions before, suppliers and vendors, are they the same?
Sorry,
Suppliers and vendors, are they the same?
That's-
You use them
yeah,
interchangeable?
essentially they're interchangeable terms,
Okay,
yeah.
great. I just wanted, so I noted with the auditor's report that departments are not assessing how the suppliers performed, and I want to talk about that with the subcontracts or the contracts to, say, lawn care professionals and snow removal. There is a little clause, some of them are for like 3 to 5 years, and there's a clause saying that if there's dissatisfaction with the performance, that the contract can be terminated. So how often does that happen?
It would be fairly rare that we would terminate a contract. So terminating a contract would be kind of, as you can appreciate, the final stage in a process, right? We would want to, have conversations, negotiate changes, support the vendor or the supplier being as successful as they can possibly be. I would say it would be pretty rare for us to terminate a contract. Not that it can't happen, but it would be relatively rare.
Because it's quite competitive, especially, I hear all the time my constituency, why did so-and-so get, such and such a tender, and, they're not doing the job. So how does one review it? Like, how do you monitor it? And your new system, will that be part of it?
So I'll let one of these good folks answer how we do it. I guess one of the things I would say in setting that conversation up is, we're certainly working on a policy that would allow us to get better at that, and our IT solution would allow us to get better at that. I think one of the things that you point out would be one of the challenges we have in the system is there are a multitude of opinions on how well a contract is going. So if I said to everyone on that side of the room, how do you like the chair you're sitting in? Well, should we buy them again? I would probably get 17 different answers about your level of satisfaction. So we need to be really careful in terms of the way we frame that feedback to say, is it impartial and related to the contract terms, and who does that? But maybe Chris can talk a little more about some of that.
Mr. Mitchell.
Thanks very much. The answer to your original question is yes. The new policy that we're going to put out speaks to exactly that. Everything from a continuum of the requirement to assess contractors in the period that they're actually delivering the service, to at some point realizing that if you can't use that assessment performance tool to get them to improve, then you could, at the end of the day, you could get them to a place where they'd be barred from future contracts with the province. If you'll allow me, I came from the city for the last 3 years. One of the interesting things is that as the department who is asking for the service, so the grass cutting service, the snow service, they are the original ones who identify we're unhappy with the service we're getting. Procurement and legal get engaged at that moment to try and determine, are there things which you can do with the contractor to try and improve that performance? It's interesting, if you think about, if you were looking at a human relations or a human resources perspective and there was no current process in place to take a look at performance of an individual, and you were starting from ground zero, you'd need to do a couple of things. You'd need to educate the people you're going to start to assess them. You'd need to come to some kind of conclusion as to who would do the assessment, and then you need to come to how many times do I have to fail or get a below service standard on that kind of performance before something will happen to me. That's very much where we are with the vendor-supplier community. Nothing exists right now, so we're going to put it into the new policy. It's in there as one of the protocols that we will begin to start doing assessments of the contracts. We have yet to build the process around how will we do that, who will do it, so that at the very least when legal comes back and says, is there a consistency to that assessment, we can say yes. So is it 0, 1, and 2? 0 if you're really not doing a good job, 1 if you're doing well, and 2 if you're exceeding all the expectations. And what does that mean? Does it have any kind of repercussion for the actual vendor downstream if they get a consistent string of zeros? Can they be barred from that? So it's in there. It's very much something which we're hoping to put in play, but it's going to take us a little time to get both the vendor community knowledge and awareness up to the actual using department and how will they do those kind of assessments, and then that sort of first trial where we go to let's let somebody go as a result of poor performance. Does it pass the legal test? Will the government say give them one more try? So it's a very much an iterative process, but we're putting the bones in place inside that new policy to begin to start that way.
Mm-hmm. So it's more or less bidder beware, especially like a harsh winter like last winter. Some of them probably did not do well because their services were required a lot more than previous years. They like a warm winter. If you're a snow removal person, you're guaranteed a profit. Okay, great. And I'd like to move around back to the status of the secondary data center. And I'd like to know, the Auditor General recommended this 4 years ago. Where is that right now?
Mr. Conrad?
So the secondary data center indeed was recommended by the Auditor General in a different audit. It's a piece of work that our information communication and technology folks have been working on pretty steadily over the course of the last number of years. One of the things I would say, where we are specifically, we've recently had an outside consultant come in and do a review for us to give us some advice and guidance on
setting up a secondary data center and how we should frame it. There's a range of opportunities there. Is it just for the province? Is it collaborative with other provinces? Is it collaborative with other entities like municipalities and universities? You know, when do you get into issues around sharing data frameworks? So it's a fairly complex issue. The other thing that's underway is, you know, it's a fast changing landscape in which we work. So just in the last number of years, as we see more and more frequently that the province, rather than own IT systems, may be buying services through the cloud, our need for data center requirements is changing quickly. So it's a bit of a challenge in that we're still committed to a secondary data center. We do have some advice, which we received fairly recently, around how to move that forward. But we'd like to have a little more framework around what is our longer-term IT strategy on which pieces of technology will we own and need to house in a data center, and which pieces will we in the future be going to the cloud. Things which in the past we were required to own in the system, my understanding is vendors are now talking about they may not even allow us to buy in the system. They may require us to go to the cloud for those. So again, where in the past we would have said, oh, for everything we own, we need a data center environment to house it in. In the future, there may be things where we're not even allowed to put in our own data center depending on the vendor. So we're definitely in progress. It's a significant piece of work. There is money allocated to allow us to construct and work on a secondary data center, but we just want to make sure we get best value for the province before we pull that trigger. So we have identified sort of what the key things are that government needs to stand up in the event of an emergency, and have put in place some secondary systems within inside of our own existing frameworks. You know, should email go down, we have ways to stand that back up, but it's not a full, robust secondary data center by any means.
Okay, but it's coming.
It's coming.
It's coming. Thank you very much.
That was a long way of saying it's coming.
Okay, great. I'll pass this along to Ms. Miller.
Ms. Miller.
Hi, and thank you. A small question. Prior to the Auditor General's report, was your department aware that several departments had vendors supplying professional services before the contract was properly signed?
So the Auditor General certainly raised, again, I would say it's one of the recommendations in terms of the acceptance that we really need to work on. So the issue around the date of contract signing, we're certainly aware that there are circumstances in which that happens. So there are circumstances you can imagine in which it might be appropriate to have an alternate procurement or a way to step aside. So if you picture the hospital last Thursday night, a pipe breaks and it's 5 o'clock in the morning. Chris was actually on the phone with some folks at 5 o'clock in the morning that were needing to say, you know, I need some support right now to do these things. Do I have to go out and get 3 bids and, you know, do an assessment? Clearly, we're not going to do that in that environment. So there are times where having work done without a contract in place is an acceptable place. There are times when it's not appropriate. What the Auditor General raised was there are a few places where in their reviews they saw where it was the contracts were not signed and they should have been signed. So again, when we look into a tool like the Ariba tool that we're putting in place, which puts online and in real time our ability to see when did they request the service, when was the contract initiated, when was the evaluation done, when was it signed, when did the work start, it gives us a much deeper view into the ability to ensure and monitor that those contracts are signed. So yeah, we were technically aware, but some of the ones that specifically that the Auditor General raised, we would not have been aware of in terms of the day-to-day activity because we just don't have that depth of sight at the moment.
Right. And Section 4.43 says that one TIR contract for $2.2 million and one ISD contract, which was $440,000, they were signed 4 days and 3 days after the work began, respectively, and one contract was signed but not dated. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Mr. Conrad?
So I can't necessarily speak in detail about the TIR contracts. Again, I think we need to be, I'm in no way trying to diminish what the Auditor General has raised. It's absolutely appropriate to raise it as a concern, and if we don't have a signed contract, we definitely have a higher level of risk than if we have a signed contract, because you don't have agreement on the dispute resolution and things like that. In some of those cases, for example, I think the one inside of our own department, it was a project that we were working on that would have been in place. There would have been contracts being shifted back and forth between us and the vendor, various iterations, draft. It might in fact have been signed by the vendor side, have been sent back to us yet to be signed on our side. So in some ways when you read the report it sounds like, oh, there were people in there working on a $400,000 project with no agreement on what they were supposed to do. That's not the issue that the Auditor General, I think, is, as far as I'm aware, is identifying. I think the issue they're saying is, although there were draft contracts, there was material, there was a good understanding, there'd been meetings, the reality was until 3 days after the work had started, we didn't have that signed legal agreement. So if something had gone wrong in those first 3 days, our ability to defend ourselves or to go after retribution or to get payback or something, should something have happened, was much diminished. So, I think those are places where we've identified, when you look across 31 contracts, there's certainly a number of recommendations there that we take absolutely seriously. We completely agree with the observation. But again, the perception that there was no, if anyone had the perception there was no paperwork or no background material of those contracts, people just started working and then we figured it out later, that's not the reality of how that worked. So
It's good news. It's good to hear. I also want to thank the Auditor General for all the points that they bring up forward to different departments. I think it's really important. It sort of gives you that level different. You can look at it a different way and see where there are improvements. And I can certainly see that next time that you're sitting here before us, that it'll be another story and be a lot more learned and a lot more programs, and are going to be active and working better. So thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unless there are any further questions, which I do not see, we will now, Mr. Connor, allow you a chance to provide some closing comments.
thank you so much. So thank you to the committee members for inviting us in today. Again, I would say thank you to the Auditor General for the balanced audit and giving us recommendations which we could accept and commit to carry forward. I would just like in closing again to acknowledge the tremendous work that gets done by the staff of my department and other departments. Civil servants take their accountability very seriously, do their best in sometimes very challenging circumstances to balance some of these factors we've talked about today. Chris and Natalie's team and the procurement team are phenomenally hard workers, really committed to what they do. So I just really appreciate what they bring. I often say I have the privilege of standing up and talking about the great work that they do, and it's one of the great privileges in my job. So I'm really pleased with the work we give. So thank you very much for inviting us. We appreciate the time.
Thank you for being with us this morning. Our next meeting will be on October 7th. We have the Department of Finance to discuss Chapters 2, 3, and 7 of the Auditor General's 2015 financial report. And there will be a brief meeting right after this, so we will take a short recess, and that meeting will be to have a briefing with the Auditor General to prepare for the October 7th meeting. So we will now take a short recess. Thank you.